Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the grand keynote address on day one of TiCon Kerala 2020. Over the next 90 minutes, we have two speakers, Todd Boyman and Nawaz Miran, talk about one of my favorite topics, food. I would like to introduce the moderator, Anupam Dutta, for this session's first keynote address. This is titled Future of Food. Anupam Dutta is an FMCG professional with close to 30 years of experience in general management, marketing, and sales, with leading multinationals and large Indian organizations. He has been leading businesses for the last 15 plus years across regions spanning South Asia as well as South Africa. As a business advisor, his key competencies include bringing focus on strategic thinking and excellence in execution to drive organizational objectives and deliver sustainable growth. It promises to be a really interesting session. Over to you, Anupam.
Thank you. Thank you, Revati, so much for the kind words of introduction. And we also have with us, obviously, the star of the evening, Todd Boyman, the CEO of Hungry Planet. So very quickly, Todd is a serial entrepreneur and impact investor who has worked globally, founding and investing in a variety of companies ranging from tech to food to trading. He has eaten strictly plant-based for over 30 years. That's a long time. And is committed to building enterprises shaping the humane economy that will sustainably provide for our growing human family and help renew, regenerate, and heal our planet. So clearly, Todd is someone who believes in putting his money where his mouth is and his heart is. So as co-founder and CEO of Hungry Planet, Todd is building the first company in the world to develop a full range of premium plant-based meats that handle, prepare, cook, and taste like conventional meat and can be used as a one-on-one substitution in any cuisine and any recipe. Hungry Planet started as a passion project, and like most entrepreneurship projects, I guess, continues to be a passion project, and is now a leader in helping transform our global food system in partnership with culinary innovators across the globe. Some quick ground rules. I think you can put in your questions. They can be typed in and they will be visible to Todd and me. If they fit into a particular area that is being discussed, I shall endeavor to bring the question up for Todd to answer. Else, we will have some dedicated time prior to the conclusion of the session to answer them. Yeah? Sounds good. So Todd, food, obviously a core need. I have worked most of my life in food, and so are you. And to have it available for the future in a sustainable manner is possibly one of the most critical needs facing an ever burgeoning human population, right? Having said that, in my experience at least, taste, texture, flavor, etc., form a very intrinsic part of the product development success. And cultural acceptance is a huge need for continued growth beyond believers into the mainstream consumption basket. So off we go. And just for starters, would you like to tell me and the audience, how did this all begin in your mind? What was the genesis of the idea? How long you thought about it, and what made you feel so passionately about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me join with you your evening, my morning. Delighted to be joining you all here. So yeah, I mean, food is just, it's essential, right? It's one of the things that you can't live without. And really this started with a deep conviction that the single most important thing that we could do individually, both as an entrepreneur, and I started this business with my sister, who's a co-founder, Jody, was to really focus on how can you give people food that is flat out delicious. As you said, food isn't great, people aren't going to eat it, but how can you give people food that is delicious and sustainable and will fundamentally help bend the curve on human and planetary health? So that's the mission of our business, is to focus on that. And when you look behind the data and the science of what's degrading our planet, what's degrading our bodies, it comes down to our food and our food supply chain. And so that was really the genesis. It was over a decade ago where we realized we could spend a lot of time and money trying to educate people on how they might eat different and why they may eat different. But ultimately, we realized that we just had to give people the food that they love to eat, and make it food that they actually would love to eat, in a different format. So rather than passing plant proteins through animals, let's just take those plant proteins and convert those directly to meat without using kind of the cow, the chicken, the pig as the mechanism to do that conversion.
Right. So obviously, I mean, you speak with a lot of passion, and that brings me to my next question, because this is, after all, an entrepreneurial session, and most of the audience are entrepreneurs. So when you are speaking with this passion, how strong and how important are purpose and passion in an entrepreneur's journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all starts there, right? I mean, if you don't have a clear purpose and you don't have a clear passion, you're just going to burn out, and you might not even get started. Being an entrepreneur is just filled with challenges, and if you've got the mindset that sees every challenge as an opportunity, you kind of work through all those. But passion and purpose are absolutely essential. And for me, entrepreneurship really starts with that question of why. Why do you want to do this? What problem are you trying to solve? Is it that you're just trying to make some money? Is it trying to solve an intractable problem that you think leads to a societal good? Are you looking for more autonomy in your life? But really understanding why you want to do it and making sure that that purpose is clear and that you've got passion behind it. Because things, I mean, the one certain thing about being an entrepreneur, of course, is that nothing's going to go the way that you plan for it to go, and it's going to be a lot more challenging than you could ever expect. So yeah, you're spot on, right? Purpose and passion are essential to this entrepreneurial journey that a lot of people head down.
And it seems like you're sticking to those, because obviously those decide the boundary conditions of how your business is going to operate and what you're going to operate in. And when you start out, I mean, what are some of the most critical aspects at the very beginning of the journey? Because I mean, just to quote something, usually you often find that there are, as often happens with an innovator, there are multiple ideas kind of swirling around in your mind, and it's possible to get kind of a little bit derailed, so to speak, rather than focus and stay on track. So, what are some of the most critical aspects that helped you keep that focus at the beginning of this journey?
Yeah, well, I think for this specific journey, it really, as you mentioned in the introduction, it started as a passion project. So that had been there for decades, right? Jody and I and other members of our family had eaten entirely plant-based for many decades. So, we had that passion that was deeply rooted in us. And I think for us, that next step was really figuring out, well, how do you take that passion and how do you convert that into really concrete, tangible action and move that forward? So for us, it wasn't necessarily an issue of getting distracted with other things because this passion was so clear for us. It really was an issue of prioritizing it because, my background as an entrepreneur, where I've done lots of different things, I had multiple software businesses going. And for me, it was really a question of, okay, I need to set aside my other activities and focus on this, 100%. I need to focus on it now because, the time was right to solve this problem. As an entrepreneur, you might come up with a great idea and the timing just isn't right? And so you need to make sure that you're riding the right wave and you're not too far ahead of where the market is. Otherwise, you'll burn through a lot of time and energy and potentially money, only to blaze the path for somebody else who eventually will come along with a wonderful solution. And all of us who lived through the tech bubble back in the late 90s, early 2000, recall a lot of tech names that aren't around anymore that really laid the groundwork and educated everybody about what the potential is. And now we have companies like Google that we all know, but Google was not the first in that space. So I think that's part of it, is really making sure that you're focused at the right time on an opportunity that can be successful.
Awesome. So, and then what does it then take to transform such a perspective which you have? And it could be, for example, ahead of its time. It could be uh, something which is completely out of the left field. What does it take to transform such a perspective into some kind of a product and brand proposition? And what did you do when you were about to start? What kind of market scoping work, maybe? What kind of product development thoughts? Did you test the product? Do you develop a brand proposition around eat good, do good, platform, etc., etc.? Any packaging development work that you did? So give us some nuggets of wisdom on that.
Yeah, well, I think the answer to that question is different based on what product you're launching and where perhaps in the market readiness you are. So in the specific case of Hungry Planet, where we were the vision was plant-based meats. It started, of course, with the passion of this is a problem that we want to solve. We see it as a global opportunity and a global need, and we saw that all the data was there to support that if you solve this issue, you will help bend the curve on human and planetary health. So that was kind of our cornerstone. We knew that was absolutely true. What we didn't know was the timing of the market, right? So there was, to your question about scoping the market and understanding, customer feedback and whatnot. There weren't any customers that we could go to when we first kind of conceived this idea and ask them the question of, do you want a plant-based meat, right? Because even today, there are plenty of people who'd look at you and say, well, what's that? And so really, our foundation was that core belief that the data supported that if you solve this problem, you address major societal planetary issues. And the data would also indicate that it needed to be solved sooner rather than later. And eventually, just by sticking with it, we got to the point, and this was probably about 3 or 4 years ago, and this was after having worked on this for over a decade, that people were starting to be curious about what we were doing. And then we could start getting that feedback and that validation of, oh, this is good. But to have gone out there on day one to ask people, we've got this idea of creating wonderful plant-based meats, people would have looked at us and say, why are you doing that? And quite frankly, until about 24 months ago, that was more often than not the reaction that we got. It really has caught fire in the past 18, 24 months. But all the way up leading to that, it was a fairly lonely journey in that people didn't understand what we were doing and why we were doing it. So it's a lot of persistence, right? I mean, it's you can scope out the market. We understood that globally, conventional meat is a $1.4 trillion market globally, right? So yeah, we knew that it was a massive opportunity. And we knew that market primarily is pork and then chicken and then beef and then lamb and others. So we understood the parameters of the space that we were going into, but there weren't really any consumers that we could go to validate this idea because people just didn't understand the concept.
Okay, excellent. So clearly, I think, but at the same time, I mean, my other question was, while you were trying to make the entire value proposition kind of come alive, what were your key focus areas? I mean, food, as both of us know. I mean, I remember in the US, I was developing a set of nutraceuticals. And I was working on this brand, and then we had some suppliers coming in with some products. And the first thing every consumer told us was, it's got to taste great. And how important was that in your product development?
Yeah, you're spot on.
Processes?
Yeah, if you're working in food, it starts with taste and texture. Coming from a software background, when we started to model out what we wanted to create, we kind of created a multi-level Venn diagram, right? So for those who are familiar with that, right, you're kind of taking these circles and you're laying them on top of each other and figuring out what's the intersection. And so for us, our tier one Venn diagram that we created was, taste, texture, sustainability, which by definition, plant-based meat should be more sustainable than a conventional meat, and then a healthful nutritional, right? So those are the 4 components that we wanted to hit right where all those overlap. So that's where it started. It had to be delicious. So while we couldn't go out and ask people, do you want a plant-based meat? We always know that people are looking for delicious food. And given the choice, they'd rather have one that's healthier than not, so long as the food tastes great. Yeah. And then on top of that, we laid another Venn diagram of, does it handle, store, prepare, and cook like conventional meat? And then, kind of the final piece was, can we produce this at scale with ingredients that are available globally, on equipment that's available globally? And will this work in global cuisines? Right? I mean, there's anyone who's been to business school or has studied kind of business texts is familiar with, Henry Ford when he was coming out with the first automobiles at scale, the Model T. And, his famous phrase was, you can have it any color you want so long as it's black.
Yeah,
Well,
right.
that doesn't work when you're doing food, right? I mean, you can't say, well, here's what we've done, and it's, got the taste and the texture and the seasoning that a North American consumer is going to love.
Yeah.
It's got to work just as well in India and China and France and Brazil. And so that really is important when you're working on food. The taste has got to be right, and then everything else kind of falls out from there.
Awesome. Okay. So, and while kind of mainstreaming the idea, I mean, obviously, as an entrepreneur, as an innovator, you also want the uniqueness of the idea to be preserved. How do you go about doing that? Because the moment you start mainstreaming, you kind of start losing the unique part of it. And if you want to be too unique, then you're niche. So how do you maintain that balance, Todd?
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating thing to kind of unpack, isn't it? Is, well, how do you figure out, because you don't want to just kind of stay in your, in your labs developing this amazing product and not getting out there. And yet once you do that, particularly when it's something kind of novel and unique, are you going to lose the opportunity to actually develop a successful business and have the impact that you want? So for us, there are probably a couple layers to that. I mean, there is the layer of just where do you use patents, and that's true in any type of product. In food, it's different from others because with food, it's very easy to reverse engineer and engineer around a patent. So we've always worked with trade secrets, right? So as we were developing our food, we were very careful to make sure that we had the right framework in place, both legal as well as process, to make sure that our intellectual property was properly protected and wouldn't just walk out the door from people who came, did some work, and ended up leaving. But then when it came time to launch, really the protection that you have is just by having a fantastic product, right? That really proves to meet a need, and then making sure that the brand that you have delivers on the promise, right? You can't go out, in our case, in a plant-based segment, for example, and have a plant-based meat that isn't also healthy for you, right? And that, as you recall, was one of the key parts of our base Venn diagram that we created, was that we had to have that because we understood that our brand promise of Hungry Planet, how do you feed a hungry planet? Well, it's for food that's better for the planet and it's better for you. And so you can't launch a product, a plant-based meat, if that's your brand promise and if that's the problem you're trying to solve, that isn't truly better for you. So, we just knew that by being true to what our mission was and executing to that the best we possibly could, other people will come up, and a lot have. I mean, every day there's a new headline about a new company that's getting funded with, tens of millions, in some cases hundreds of millions, to go after this problem, who, weren't even thinking about this problem 24 months ago. But now that there's a market, there's just a huge flood of money that's going into it. And for me, that's fantastic. Jody and I look at that and we're like, wonderful. The world is starting to change, right? People are understanding that this solves a real problem. It's a real opportunity, and that people can build successful businesses. But it means, coming back to that initial question that you asked, it's having a purpose, having a passion, and staying true to that, and not cutting corners for the sake of a short-term benefit. And so, in our case, that's what we've done. And I think we've developed a brand now that people recognize is authentic, that we do what we say what we're going to do, and that the products that we release are superior, both in taste and texture and nutrition. And in our case, we also have committed 30% of the founder's equity of our business to the Hungry Planet philanthropic project. So we are actually giving back to our communities from day one. And we started doing that before we were even making money, because it was kind of ingrained in what we were about as a company, as a brand, and as a team that we were building.
Awesome. So if I were to put you in a spot, not in a spot, if I were to push you to say, okay, Todd, in one line, tell me what therefore is the purpose of your organization. Why does it exist?
Yeah, I mean, it exists very simply to bend the curve on human and planetary health. And we absolutely believe, and I think the science substantiates, that the most impactful thing that any of us can do to change the trajectory of where the planet is going and what's happening to our bodies through the food that we eat is to change what we eat, to change that entire supply chain. So yeah, it is to bend the curve on human and planetary health. And every decision that we make, we look at that as kind of the core principle. And if the decision takes us down a different path away from that, it doesn't get done.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. There's also this whole point before we get into, the critical stages of your business and what all it went through. Um, Food is also a very difficult area, as I've realized. I have worked across food companies and across the globe. So, because it's such an incredible part of your culture. In India, they say that the food taste changes every 300 kilometers. So it's
Deliciously so, though, in the case of India, right? All the cuisine is fantastic. So you
yeah,
can't go
that's what we like to believe. But having
wrong.
said that, it's still very different. I mean, Andhra food versus Orissa food versus Kerala food versus Bengal food versus what is touted as Indian food, which is fundamentally North Indian cuisine. Um, so, how do you ensure that your offerings fit into the cultural milieu? And how important was this aspect in product development?
Yeah. Hugely important. I mean, you're right. I mean, food is so essential to how we live our lives, our family gatherings, just the cultural richness of all of our communities. Food is at the center, whether it's weddings or birthdays or festivals, it often centers around food.
Right.
And so the idea that you come up with one food and say, look, this is going to work for everybody just isn't the case. And if you look at Coca-Cola as a perfect example, you can go get a Coke in every country in the world, but it's going to be slightly differently flavored,
Right.
depending on where you're consuming that. It's still branded as Coke. And so I think when you look at meat and you look at plant-based meat, we understood that fundamentally it is important to get it right, and that we're not going to know exactly how, every 10 kilometers in India, people are going to use our food, right? That's an impossible way to do that market analysis. But knowing that variety is out there, we would construct the food to make sure that what we are replicating is authentically as close as possible matching conventional meat. Because a chicken is a chicken everywhere on the planet.
Right.
How it is processed, how it's seasoned, how it's cooked, how it's consumed is different. But if you can get that chicken authentically to match a conventional chicken, that's your baseline, right? So that's what we did. We said, look, we're not going to get in the business of trying to create something that is highly seasoned and highly tailored to any one particular market. We just want to give people great chicken. So when people eat this, they don't go, oh, that's Hungry Planet chicken. They just simply say, oh, that's chicken, or that's pork, or that's crab, or that's whatever. So I think that's how in the food space we approached it, is we wanted to match conventional meat as closely as possible, because that's what chefs know what to work with, right? Whether it's a professional chef or a home chef. Give me conventional meat, and I can localize that, and I can turn that into my regional favorite or my home favorite. So for us, that was really the challenge, is let's strip away all the other pretenses of thinking that we can solve individual cuisines and just give people the core meat.
Excellent. And what critical stages has your business, and speak to me as an entrepreneur, because a lot of people would like to know this. How do you take it from that initial idea or a very small low-key launch kind of a thing into something a lot larger? What kind of initial launch, test marketing, scaling up is one area, brand marketing, competition management, retailer engagement. How do you take it to the next level? I mean, you have passion, you have purpose, you have a product that you think is great. How do you take it out there? How do you give it scale?
Yeah. Well, and in the food business, for me, not coming from the food business, coming as a tech entrepreneur, scaling is, I talked with my tech partner, scaling bits and bytes that we work with in the software industry is very different from scaling bytes of burgers, right? I mean, it's just, food is so different from software. And so the learning curve for Jody and me was enormous, right? You can have a lot of experience as an entrepreneur, and I have as, serial entrepreneur and as an investor. But when you roll up your sleeves and you tackle something that's entirely new in a new category, there's a lot to learn. I guess I would start by saying there's a huge degree of humility, right? You need to understand what you don't know, and you need to be willing to go search out people who are just a lot smarter than you and can help, connect the dots in areas that you don't even know necessarily to ask the question. So for us, that was an important part of it. But just as we were developing the food, I think we would go out and we would find people who would be curious enough to taste the food. And give us the feedbacks and iterate back, cycle after cycle that this tastes good or it doesn't taste good. And then when we got to the point, and this was about 2 or 3 years ago, that it was clear that the food was really fantastic, we realized that we need to hire people who came from the food industry, but were kind of agile enough to look at things differently. And also shared the passion, not necessarily about plant-based, because a lot of people, weren't familiar with it, but really shared the passion of making a difference, right? And could go from, just as you've spent your career in, large companies, but being very entrepreneurial within them, finding people such as yourself, right, that had that big company food experience, but just had that desire and that energy to say, I want to be a part of an insurgent brand. I want to be a part of something new that is kind of recreating, what we think of as food, because it's exciting and because it will make a difference. And so that's, for me, that's been the best education, right? Is learning from these people who come in and, they'll kind of chuckle and go, Todd, you're just all over the place. You got this idea and this idea and this idea. And that's what led to, obviously, the creation of Hungry Planet, but the scaling of it and bringing the focus, every single day of how we talk about the brand. Who do we go launch this with? What grocery stores? That's the focus that, honestly hasn't come from me. That's not my wiring. It's come from the professionals that I've brought on board who have, stints at places like McKinsey and Frito-Lay and have been very good at kind of channeling the energy and the passion that Jody and I brought to really professionalize what we do as we start scaling up.
Awesome. So I'll ask you a trick question here. Coming from primarily a vegetarian country, about anywhere between 30 to 40%, I think more like 40% of our country is vegetarian. So what's your core consumer segment? Are you looking at meat eaters to try you as a core segment, or are you looking at vegetarians who would love to have a taste of meat to try you?
Yeah, well, certainly, look, we welcome vegetarians and vegans who really miss having that type of food. But our core market are people who, love meat. Because, again, if you come back to, the cornerstone of this business of bending the curve on human planetary health, to do that, we really aren't going to make a big difference by taking that 14% in India that's already eating that way. Or in the United States, it's anywhere, about 5% at any one time. They're already doing their thing to solve the problem that fundamentally we want to solve. So it's trying to reach all those others. And the data in the United States shows that while at any one time, maybe there's 5% of the population that tries to eat vegetarian or vegan, no animal products at all, but there's an 80% churn over 3 years on that cohort, meaning that there are a lot of ex-vegans and vegetarians out there because people just don't stick with it, right? And I know that when I became plant-based, it was really difficult. I didn't particularly like vegetables or tofu and all those things that people traditionally associated with eating plant-based, but I stuck with it. So that probably makes me a good entrepreneur, right? I'm pretty persistent when I set my mind to something. But for everybody, who just is curious about it, and in the United States, they call them flexitarians, right? People who are plant curious, who used to be vegan or vegetarians, or people who just understand that for their own personal health, they have to eat differently. That's who we're focused on. And if we can get that group of people around the world to eat, one meal a week, one meal a day that's plant-based, and Hungry Planet can provide the on-ramp for them to do that, where they don't really have to change anything other than just saying, hey, instead of having the chicken patty, I'll have the Hungry Planet chicken patty. That's a major win, and that's what starts changing the world. So that's who we're really focused on.
Awesome, awesome. And in terms of just when you were thinking of getting it into the market, obviously you had a product. You would have spoken to retailers, you would have spoken to interested parties. And while I'll come to the investment part of it later on in a bit, but what kind of product pricing, how do you understand where to fit in this product? Did you look at pricing critically, or was it just a cost plus kind of a model that you went with?
Yeah, well, initially it started off as a technical problem, like could we even create this type of food?
Right.
And then it gets to a market adoption issue of once you've figured out that you can create this food and can hit all these metrics that we're targeting, it then is a market adoption issue where you then run right into that issue of, well, how do you price it? So it's a little bit of both, candidly. I mean, we've got to look at what are our ingredients, what are our costs to produce the food. And then we also look at where is conventional meat. And what's interesting about this space is because we've launched with 9 different protein types, it's not just one type. When you map that to conventional meat, conventional meat is priced at lots of different levels depending on what you're buying. So in the United States, for example, if you're buying chicken, you can buy that at $1.90 a pound, and that's double that or more for a kilo, right? So $4.55 for a kilo. Yeah. Whereas beef is normally $5 to $6 a pound, and crab is $14 a pound. So there's a further piece of education of the market, to your point of, well, how do you price this and how do you educate both retail consumers who are going to buy it for home consumption, as well as food service that are going to put it into meals at universities and hospitals, and they have in their mind that if they're doing a chicken entree, they're allocating $1.50 a pound, and we're suddenly coming in and saying it's different. In the plant-based world, all these proteins are about the same because they're all built off of the same platform, essentially. And that means that we're at about $5.50 to $6 a pound. So if you're used to buying chicken, you're like, well, this is crazy expensive. I can't buy your chicken, but your crab is cheaper than conventional crab, so I can buy that all day long. Mm-hmm. So there is market education, and we've developed ways of talking about that, both with consumers and food service as part of gaining market adoption. If the food isn't great, it doesn't work, but if your pricing doesn't work, you also aren't going to get too far. So we're in the right spot for where we need to be right now, and we're constantly driving to be ultimately at price parity with the cheapest, least expensive types of meats. But that's going to be a multi-year journey to accomplish that piece.
I agree. And as an entrepreneur, I mean, obviously, people talk of valuations and crazy investments and huge advertising expenses. And having fundamentally worked in brick and mortar kind of businesses, Kellogg, 100 plus years, Cadbury's 100 plus years, which took a long time to get to the kind of valuations that they are at. Sometimes I get a little worried because here I see companies which have sales value and accumulated losses at similar levels. So that worries me. So how do you sustain, how do you attract, sustain investor interest? And then basically, how do you manage, for want of a better word, how do you manage your cash? Because that's critical for a business that is just starting up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe to take those in reverse order, how do you manage the cash, right? If you don't have cash, you're not going to play, the next round. We've always been really, really frugal in terms of how we've spent the money. We've spent it on the things that are important. And that's important to me as an entrepreneur. It's also been important to me as an investor, to work with entrepreneurs who really understand that while they may be raising money from somebody else, they need to treat it as if it's their own. And it doesn't suddenly mean staying at a 5-star hotel. It means, making sure that you are using that cash really, really wisely. The first part of that question is also fascinating. I think as people who are entrepreneurs and are thinking through that journey, it's something that every entrepreneur really needs to settle on, of how do they want to fund that business and what are they committing to by making that particular decision.
Right.
There's the Silicon Valley model that you're kind of, referring to, where you're going, and, the valuations can be crazy, but ultimately those valuations are tied to the size of the opportunity. So in the plant-based meat segment, the pitch, if I went to Silicon Valley, if I wanted to raise, hundreds of millions of dollars or billions to go after this, and there are companies in the space who've done that, the pitch is this is a $1.4 trillion global market in conventional meat that has not been disrupted and is going to have to be disrupted if we as a human species are going to survive, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a big idea. That's a big framework. And, Silicon Valley VCs are going to be like, great, go after that. And they will, value that according to what the opportunity is and what the team is and their ability to execute. But you can go after that same opportunity as I have to say, I want to self-fund this because I don't know when the market is going to be ready, and I don't know when our products are going to be ready. And so I'm just going to fund this on my own and develop the best food that I can. And we've spoken a little bit about how we've thought that through, and be ready for when the market starts turning. So while we've been involved in educating the market and given talks at places like Harvard University and some of the largest tech firms in the world to educate people over the decades, ultimately not worry about being the person to go spend hundreds of millions of dollars to educate the market, but to be the person and be the company with the best foods. So it's a fundamental decision that you've got to make, as how big is the opportunity and what journey do you want to be on, because those journeys are very different. And we've been approached repeatedly by venture money that has said, go big, move from the Midwest where we wanted to base this company to Silicon Valley and, take this money and go big or go home. We're like, we don't think that's the right way to go in this market. And that was our call. Others have made different calls and are building, wildly successful businesses. So you can head down any of those paths. But as an entrepreneur, it ought to be an intentional decision, because if it's not an intentional decision, you're going to find yourself on top of this monster that isn't really staying true to what you wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And you're going to be beholden to other people going after something in a way that isn't authentic. So it's a hugely important question. And I think, before you head down in a big way this entrepreneurial journey, you've got to be very, very clear. What path do you really want to be on, and make sure that every decision that you make is true to that, or you'll find yourself working very, very hard and being very unhappy because it's not the situation that you thought that you were going after.
Yeah. And as a small entrepreneur, I think I can completely understand. My bent of mind is absolutely like yours. I mean, I don't believe necessarily in go big or go home, but rather build a sustainable kind of a business over a period of time. So how does the future look, Todd? What are your plans? How do you formulate the plans? One step at a time. There are certain other trends, veganism, vegetarianism, planet sustainability, etc., which are also trends which are coming up pretty strongly. How do they shape your waking hours, and how do they shape your thoughts about the future?
Yeah, well, I think that the future is very bright across the board, right? I mean, I think it's bright for what we're doing. And I think just, as a human family, I think, there are obviously always challenges out there, but entrepreneurs, the community here that we're talking with today, of people who look at the world not as a bunch of problems to be solved, but as opportunities to kind of figure out how do you make things better, gives me an enormous amount of hope. And so for us, at Hungry Planet, it's very hopeful. We get validated every day in the marketplace as our sales teams are out there, and as we've been scaling, that as we talk with consumers and we talk with buyers, whether it's in food service or retail, we see the light goes on, right? And people are like, wow, I didn't realize that this could be done. So, for us, it's a long road ahead of us still. We're still in the first inning, even though a lot of people now are aware that you can replicate conventional meat with plant-based meat. So for us, it is continuing to improve the product, every week, every month, every year. And our hope is that, in a decade or so, the amount of conventional meat that's being consumed is dramatically decreased, and it's replaced, on a one-to-one basis with plant-based meat, and hopefully a fair portion of that comes from Hungry Planet. But we also believe, a fair portion will come from all the other players that are out there. So, we really are working to build this space and educate both consumers, competitors, and others about the opportunity here, and encourage people to, if this is a passion, to figure out how to work on the food opportunities that are out there to feed everybody with more sustainable foods.
Great, Todd. I think the time's just flown by. We've got 5 more minutes. So one final question for you, for all the budding and entrepreneurs in the audience, and I've actually incorporated some of their questions like purpose and pricing, etc., into our discussion already. What would be the 2 or 3 key thoughts you would want to leave behind? I mean, as an entrepreneur.
Oh, the 2 or 3, look, I think as an entrepreneur, the key is you've got to be true to yourself, right? I mean, you really have to understand yourself well, and obviously, you're going to grow and develop as an individual. So who you are today isn't the person you're going to be a year from now and a decade from now. But you've got to be true to yourself, and don't be kind of corrupted by taking short corners, or enticed by other people telling you that you're either greater than you are or that you're not as good as you know that you are. You've got to be absolutely confident in what your abilities are, and at the same time having the humility to know what you don't know, to reach out for help, right? And surround yourself with people who share those values and can make you better. And for me, that's the most important piece, is really understanding who you are, staying true to that, and then surrounding yourself with just wonderful people, and not getting pulled down and distracted by thinking there's a shortcut to success, because there isn't. All the overnight successes that you read about in the trade press, I mean, it's always it makes a nice story, but more often than not, the reality is there are decades of work behind the scenes that people don't know about that led to that success. Yeah. So stay curious, stay open-minded. Stay true to yourself, and have enormous confidence, but also have enormous levels of humility to know to reach out for help and build a network of like-minded individuals.
Fantastic. I mean, thank you, Todd. Thank you very much for an incredibly informative session. Thanks to all the attendees for staying on and listening to pearls of wisdom from Mr. Todd Boyman. And do stay connected for the next session. Networking rooms will be opened at the end for participants to reach both Todd and me. So kindly make use of the networking rooms as you deem fit. Thank you, Todd. As always, wonderful talking to you, and had a great time listening to you and understanding from you how to drive a business from a brilliant idea that you're passionate about to a sustainable livelihood for a multitude of people. And thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to share this time with you and everyone else who's participating in this event, and look forward to networking with people afterwards. And once we get this global pandemic behind us, look forward to returning to India. I just love your country, and maybe we'll take one of those trips, and we'll every couple of kilometers we'll stop and taste some of that wonderful, unique cuisine that you have. So look forward to seeing you in person and meeting others in this group in person sometime, hopefully in the not too distant future. So thank you for sharing this time with me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Todd. Early morning. Have a great day.
Great. Thank you. You as well.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.